So very welcome to Hatfield Christian Church. Thank you for coming. I believe my name, before I say anything further, my name is Gerben Groten. Don't try to pronounce that without hurting your throat. It's not so important. I'm just here to host you tonight. On behalf of the church, I'm a member of the executive team here, and they asked me if I could please introduce the main speaker, which is the only speaker tonight. So I'll do that just in a minute. Before I do that, I just want to say my sincere and our sincere apologies for those who have been here since 6:30, because I believe we've advertised this event as a church and as through the Ravi Zacharias International Ministries for 7:30, but I believe there has been some creative people made some posters and put it up in various places in the city. You enjoyed each other's company, and you delved into like the furthest, darkest corners of your mind to conjure up those questions that you've always wanted to ask, but you couldn't get to those questions where you given 5 minutes before this event, and now you had a whole hour. So I trust you have sharpened your questions for Mr. Michael Ramsden, and if not, then well, you're welcome anytime to this building and just sit here for an hour. And but I do apologize for the confusion, and we'll make sure in the future everybody knows about the one and only time that we start. It's a great privilege and a great honor to introduce to you a wonderful man. And this is Mr. Michael Ramsden. He's all the way from Oxford in the UK, where he lives with his wife Anne and his 3 children, I believe. Am I informed correctly? That is good. I always check these things because there's nothing more awkward than telling somebody that he has 5 children and he doesn't know about it. So there you go. 1 wife, 3 children. Remember that. Yes. Mr. Michael Ramsden was brought up in the Middle East and then moved to the UK, where he started working for Lord Chancellor's department, investing funds, and he taught moral philosophy and lectured as an at the International Seminar for Jurisprudence and Human Rights in Strasbourg as well. And he's been a scholar in residence at the Wolfsberg Executive Development Centre in Switzerland. But most of you will know him as the international director of the Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, as well as a joint director in Oxford of the Oxford Centre for Apologetics, for Christian Apologetics. He's also been lecturing at the White House and addressed leaders at NATO headquarters in Brussels, members of the European Parliament, as well as banking professionals and investment managers on the recent global financial crisis. When I asked him earlier tonight what he's going to speak about, and when he shared that sentence with me, that's quite weighty, I decided right there and then, I think it is much better that he will introduce his own talk than I can do that for you. So please, a warm Pretoria welcome for Mr. Michael Ramsden.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can I speak from down here? Okay. Am I going to cause a problem for the camera if I step down here? I'm quite tall. Can you still see me? Is it okay? All right, that way I'm closer to you in case any of you decide to leave. For those who came an hour early, I can run after you and catch you and bring you back. I am very sorry too for those of you who came early. Not even I would wait an hour to hear myself speak. So the fact that you waited an hour makes me feel even more honored to have this opportunity to speak with you. And the title that we have here today on truth and trust and work and life, if there was one word which we could use to sum up the theme for that, it would be the word integrity. When we talk about truth and trust and work and life, that's essentially the question that we're asking. What does it actually look like to have integrity? Now, we live in a world where these questions are sometimes very hard to find, and sometimes we feel like we're looking at a problem and it just feels very difficult to answer it, even though we feel that somehow the answer should be simpler. There was a story told of a guy who was a security guard who was looking after a work site in the Middle East. And his job was just to guard all the materials and the work things, that nothing was being stolen from the work site. And, that's fairly common. I'm sure you have people who have similar jobs over here. Anyway, one night the guy's sitting in his booth and a worker leaves the work site quite late after most other people have gone. And he has a wheelbarrow, and in the wheelbarrow there's an empty cardboard box. And so the guard looks at him, looks in the box is empty. Strange, but he waves him through. The next night, the same gentleman is now also leaving a couple of hours late after most people have left. And there he is with his wheelbarrow, and in the wheelbarrow there's an empty cardboard box. So this time the security guard thinks, maybe I should have a closer look. He looks in the box, he picks it up. It's empty. He puts it back in the wheelbarrow. He waves it on. Third night, same guy is there with a wheelbarrow and an empty box. Now the security guard at this point is feeling suspicious. He's sure that there's something not quite right about this. So he decides maybe the box is a distraction. What he needs to do is search the guy. So he pats the guy down. He checks him. Is he carrying anything? Guy's completely clean. So he lets him go. Fifth night, there's the guy with a wheelbarrow and an empty cardboard box. Well, the security guard he's really worried now. And then he thinks, there's a tire at the front of the wheelbarrow. It takes air. Maybe instead of air, there's something else in there. So he takes the wheel off the wheelbarrow and removes the tire, but there's just air inside. So he puts the tire back on. He pumps it back up for the guy. He lets him go. Well, this happens every night. The security guard starts losing sleep. He's waking up in the middle of the night in a panic and a sweat. He can't figure out what's going on. After almost 3 weeks of sleepless nights, 21 days later, he finally stops the guy. He says, look, you're going to have to help me out. He says, I can't sleep. I can't eat. I feel like I'm losing my mind. He says, every night you come here, every night I can't figure out what you're doing. I know you're doing something wrong. So here's the deal. Just to restore my own sanity, if you tell me what you're doing, I promise I won't stop you, but you just have to tell me, otherwise I'm not going to get any peace. So the guy, he looks around and he says, I'm stealing wheelbarrows. We so often feel that there is something right there. It should somehow literally be within our grasp, but somehow we just struggle to lay hold of exactly what it is. And very often when we're asking quite basic questions about life, like who do I trust? Or why am I here? They're questions which seem so deceptively simple. We feel that the answer should be somehow right there in front of us, but whatever it is that we're presented with seems to also present a puzzle, and we're not quite sure how we should somehow solve it or address it. Now, I was reading in the newspaper last year, an editorial column, and every so often you read something in a newspaper and it really just makes you sit up and pay attention. And this is what I read in this newspaper in the UK. The editor said, for the past half a century, we have tried to construct a world without identity and without morality. Instead, we've left it to two systems to deal with the problems of our collective life, the market economy and the liberal democratic state. Morality has been outsourced to the market. The market gives us choices, and morality has been reduced to a set of choices in which right or wrong have no meaning beyond the satisfaction or frustration of our own desires. We find it increasingly hard to understand why there might be things we want to do, can afford to do, but that we should not do, because they're dishonorable or disloyal or demeaning. In a word, unethical. Too many people in positions of public trust have come to the conclusion that if you can get away with it, you'll be a fool not to do it. And that is how leaders betray the public they were meant to serve. And when that happens, trust collapses, and as a civilization begins to decay and die. Meanwhile, the liberal democratic state has abolished national identity. The effect has been to turn society from a home into a hotel. In a hotel, you pay the price, you get a room, and you're free to do whatever you want, so long as you don't disturb any of the other guests. But a hotel is not a home. It doesn't generate loyalty, and it doesn't generate a sense of belonging. I remember reading that and just thinking that this particular editor had really hit something there right on the head. We find ourselves in a world where questions of integrity and trust we ask almost daily. We wonder who we can trust. And we also wonder who people really are. It's those same two questions. Morality, can I trust you? How do you live? And then even authenticity, who are you exactly? And we ask those questions, and so often now, because we're arranged with such a huge skill, such a massive range of problems, we struggle to be able to answer them properly. We're not sure how to live, we're not sure who we can even trust. I was reading a novel a couple of years ago by the name of a guy called Ramsden. Ramsden writes books. He's most of the authors I love reading don't tend to publish fast, they tend to publish slow. Ramsden publishes books slowly, he gives a lot of thought to each one. And now, is it still his latest book? Someone's going to Google now and correct me if I'm wrong. But his latest, or almost latest book, had a very simple title, Purity. Now, the word purity was actually a nickname for the heroine of the novel. And so this book was basically about her, each chapter written from a different perspective. And when you start reading through the book, it feels very confused. You have no idea how all these different stories will intersect. Now, Ramsden has made a name for himself in some parts of the world by writing about very ordinary life. Nothing special, no fireworks, just very ordinary, what we might even call boring life, but writing with a lot of insight. Now, some people didn't like purity because he introduced some superstars into his book, if you like, and people were beginning to wonder whether he was losing his way. But the way that novel starts is this young girl whose nickname is Purity. It's an abbreviation of her name, which is then being changed to make it that. She's working in a coffee shop. And a customer comes in, and it's a guy, and she rather likes him. And as he orders his coffee and sits there drinking his coffee, she's looking at him, and she's thinking, I'd like to get to know this guy. And then as soon as she formulates that thought, she then goes on to say something very interesting in her mind. She asks herself the following question. She says, dare I risk the intimacy of friendship? Or shall I retreat into the relative safety of casual sex? Now, what a question. Dare I risk the intimacy of friendship? When I get to know this person, will I get them to allow them to see me, who I am, the kind of person I am, my weaknesses, my strengths, my failings, my shortcomings? Will they really get to see me? As well as getting to know the things I aspire to and the things that I may espouse, will they also see how I live? Will I allow them that access to my life? Or will I not go there? Too damaging, too painful, too hurtful, and I'll just have sex with the guy. Now, isn't that a fascinating question to be asking at this point in the 21st century? We're suddenly raising questions about whether we even want to be known. Is it even too painful to live in a world where actually people get to see what we're really like or not? Who do we trust and who are we actually with? Now, these questions are going to affect and determine everything. Now, what I want to try and do is, if I can, is start by, first of all, therefore, by just saying a little bit about the morality and the ethical side of this question. Because that's the most important, it's not the most important. It's one of the ones where we most immediately struggle. Because as soon as we start talking about ethics, then there are all kinds of things we start to hear. And it goes something a bit like this. Look, it's fine for you to talk about ethics, but in the real world, I can't afford them. It's way too expensive. It's totally unrealistic in this day and age for you to talk about these things. The only people who believe in this kind of stuff are sort of pie-in-the-sky academics. So let me start off by making a few very controversial remarks. Number one, if you're a business person, the simple truth is that you make ethical and moral judgments every single day, multiple times a day. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is not that you do not do business with people you feel you cannot trust. What I mean is this. If you are doing business with someone with whom you feel you cannot trust, you demand a higher rate of return on the investment in order to justify the increased risk involved in that relationship. Otherwise, you'd go for something else. You will instinctively look for that higher rate of return in order to justify the increased risk. And we do that every single day. Every time you apply for, do you call them mortgages here, home loans? Every time you apply for one of those, you're going to be profiled. They're going to look at your background and your employment history and your voting history and your credit history, and they're trying to figure something out. For every 100 Michael Ramsdens we lend money to, how many actually bother to repay us? And if the answer is 100, they're going to give me a low interest rate. I'm a low risk. They're happy to take a low rate of return. They're going to get their capital back. But if only 1 in 2 Michael Ramsdens pay back, what kind of interest are they going to demand in order to justify the investment risk? Well, it's going to be huge. We make these decisions and calculations all the time, which rather begs the question, where on earth do we get our morals and our ethics from to help justify, to make those kinds of calculations? Most people do it instinctively, but they've never sat down long enough to actually figure out the hard question. Well, here's a second, even more controversial statement. There isn't a single organization in the world, including the family, government, whatever you name it, there isn't a single organization in the world that doesn't have morals and ethics at its center. Let me say that again. There isn't a single organization in the world that doesn't have morals and ethics at its very core. If you don't believe me, go and join the mafia. And after you've joined them, you try lying to them, stealing from them, cheating them, or betraying them. You will find they have a very highly developed sense of what is right or wrong, and their compliance department is unlike anything else you've ever encountered before in your working life. See, the question is not, is there a moral and ethical center that we operate in any organization? The question is, how big a circle do we draw? Do I draw the circle around me? That's how far it extends. Do I draw it around the family? That's what happens in the mafia. Do I draw it around the company? Or maybe my city? Or maybe my country? Or maybe my continent? Or the world? The question isn't, is there a set of commitments, moral and ethical commitments, right at the very center of our existence? The question is, how big a circle do we draw around them? Yet so often, we fool ourselves into thinking that somehow these things aren't important, but they're very important. It doesn't matter what realm of life you work in. Within the mafia, there is an absolute moral ethical code, and if you betray it, you will literally lose your life. Now, outside the family, you can do whatever you want, but within the family, it is absolute. Now, the truth is that when you extend this into the business world, there is a price to be paid by adopting a moral or ethical position. There is. And if you sit down and explain your business to me in the market you operate in, I can get a pen and paper and I can calculate how much it will cost for you. Because the cost of compliance is high. Now, interestingly, I can remember on one of the first trips I made to South Africa, I was speaking down in Cape Town, and it was a couple of days after a company called Arthur Andersen collapsed. Now, I don't know how many of you here are old enough to remember Arthur Andersen. Nobody? Maybe it's just me. Okay, it's a handful of you. Arthur Andersen, at the time of its collapse, was one of the highest paying, most aggressive, and one of the most prestigious accountancy firms in the world. It simply was. I can remember in London at the time, if you wanted to earn the most amount of money as soon as you graduated, when you did your chartered accountant exam, Arthur Andersen paid more than anyone else. And it collapsed in a matter of days and was wiped off the face of the planet because of a serious moral failing of one of its employees. It was just completely obliterated. You see, the cost of compliance is high, but the cost of failure is catastrophic. If you can remember back as far as 9/11, after the Twin Towers fell in New York, the stock markets around the world collapsed. Now, what a lot of people don't remember is that by January 2002, the market had largely recovered. However, in February 2002, the ethical scandals of WorldCom, Enron, and so on hit the financial world, and the market fell further and faster than it did after the terrorist attack of 9/11, telling you that what the market feared the most was not a terrorist attack from without, but a moral collapse from within. There is no way of getting away from these questions, because every relationship you and I have is morally and ethically governed. Now, you see, when we talk about truth and trust, by truth, we often just think some form of abstract philosophical concept, but that's not correct. Truth matters and affects everything. If I were to say, I love you, does it matter if I'm telling you the truth or not? We very often try to siphon off things like truth and love and say, well, these appeal to two different types of things. Truth to the rational mind, love to the emotional mind. But that's not correct. You can't make those kinds of divisions that neatly. And even more importantly, all of our ethics and morals also requires a form of truth in it. We're basically trying to say, are you telling me the truth? Are you presenting me the truth? Can I rely on this truth? So often when we're thinking in terms of morals and ethics, that's what we're talking about. And it governs every type of relationship we have. It governs our business relationships. It governs our trust in the government. It governs our friendships. Your friends are people who you feel you can trust. They're people who you feel will keep your confidences, who won't stab you in the back, who won't mislead you, who won't sell you out. Those are your friends. All of our relationships are morally and ethically governed. Quite a few years ago, I got into watching a little TV series, and it got axed after halfway through the third season. I was very disappointed. It was called Lie to Me. The TV show was based off the real-life research of a guy who'd done his doctorate at the University of Oxford. And what he'd done is he'd studied what were called micro-expressions. Now, if you've seen any modern-day spy movie, you'll have seen the equipment, even if you're not familiar with the term. Because what he discovered was that if you looked very closely at the corners of people's eyes, mouth, nose, and so on, it doesn't matter what culture you're from, doesn't matter what your background is, doesn't matter what your education is, none of those things matter. When we lie, there is a universal set of expressions on our face, and if you know how to read them, you can tell when someone's lying. Well, as you would expect, this guy makes a serious amount of money advising security agencies and a surprisingly large number of CEOs around the world about how to spot that. And that's why when you watch modern spy movies and they're interrogating someone, they have a camera zoomed in on the eye and also on all these different parts of the face, because that's what they're looking for. These very brief micro expressions that come up just for a flash, but actually reflect what's going on inside the inner heart. Now, as you would expect, an academic who's dedicated his entire life to trying to figure out whether people are lying or not has given some thought as to the consequences of lies. And so here are some words he penned when just talking about personal relationships. He says, trust is a matter of faith, that the person who is trusted won't exploit that trust. Intimacy in close working relationships, romance and friendship requires and in fact depends on trust. Yet it is well known that the last person to realize that he or she who is being betrayed is the person suffering the betrayal. Why? Because the betrayed person's trust blocks out recognition of any signs of the blind breach of faith, all those signs that everyone else around them can so easily pick up on. We don't want to learn that our trust is being betrayed, that the person we hired is embezzling, that our children are stealing money from our purses. It is terrible to discover our trust is being misgiven. Consequently, most of us willfully avoid any clues to its discovery. Once trust has been betrayed, can it ever be restored? Not always, and not by everyone. Even when the betrayal is forgiven, and the betrayed person doesn't want to give up the relationship, it may still in fact be very difficult to completely trust again. And that is the price of lying about very serious matters, the loss of trust that may never be restored. Suspicion, on the other hand, the opposite of trust, undermines relationship and results in the suspicious person's misery. Let me just say that again. Suspicion, on the other hand, the opposite of trust, undermines relationship and results in the suspicious person's misery. All of us face a choice, therefore. Do we, based on faith, take the risk of being misled by trusting someone? Or do we take the risk of not only disbelieving a truthful person, but never being able to establish close connection because of chronic suspicion? Now, isn't that interesting? I don't know if you've noticed, we seem to be living in an increasingly lonely world. In the UK, they've recently appointed a minister for loneliness. It's amazing to me they appointed only one. It's going to be a very lonely job. In one major survey done just recently that was reported in the BBC about the difficulties facing young people, most young people reported that their single greatest issue they faced in their life under the age of 25 was for feeling lonely. One of the recipients said, living online is the loneliest place to live your life. All of us pretending to be happy with a drink in our hand, when actually we can't admit to any kind of failing or any kind of need. One of the ladies who responded to the national survey said, every connection I have is based on falsehood. All of it is based on me projecting one kind of image to my friends and everybody else. And so this is why we have now this chronic problem. We're constantly making ethical or moral decisions all the time, whether we're aware of it or not. It's absolutely essential to life. We look for it in terms of trust. Trust is what leads to intimacy. It requires an act of faith, that based on the evidence I know about you and what I see within you, that I would be justified in putting my trust in you. Let me ask you, who do you trust? Where do you get your ethics from? How do you sustain it? There's no point pretending these things aren't important. They go right to our core. We're all asking ourselves those questions all of the time. And when you can't answer that question satisfactorily, it is absolutely impossible to trust anyone. Now, this then has a very strong connection then in terms of this thing to do with identity. Because one of the problems of being human is that we also seem to be terribly flawed. Just over a year ago, I was getting ready to speak to one of the largest accountancy firms in the world. and on why integrity matters in business. And so due to the wonders of the internet, I thought I'd get online and look at some of the top business schools in the world to see what their leading professors were saying about business ethics. I've always believed in free education, and here was a great opportunity to get up to speed. So I sat down and started watching these lectures with, I must admit, a very large pot of coffee to stay awake. Now, in one of the leading schools in the world, which I'll leave unnamed, I'm not interested in necessarily naming the individual, it doesn't achieve anything here. He was speaking to a group of very earnest students and talking about business ethics. And here's what he said to the students. He said, it has been scientifically proven that people are basically good. When you put people under pressure, when you put them in a difficult place, they will always do the right thing. And all the students sat in the room nodding and writing it down slowly. I sat at the screen shaking my head thinking, I think we may be living in two very different worlds. That's not my experience. I don't know what yours has been. In my experience, most people aspire to be good. Does that make sense? Most people, when they're young and when they start out in life, they have aspirations and dreams of being respected for leading a noble life. That the quality of your life, the way you make your decisions, the way you live, would earn admiration and respect from people around you. But the simple truth is that the first thing we learn is it doesn't matter how good things look on the outside. There are problems on the inside. The further we go in life, the more compromises we seem to make. The more difficult things we have to give in on. It feels like all of a sudden we start compromising here, there, and everywhere. We suddenly one day find ourselves inhabiting a position we never thought we would inhabit. And we wonder how on earth we got there. And the response is sometimes to feel angry with the people who told us about trying to aspire to lead a good life, because it seems so impossible. What I think is much more realistic description of the kind of battle we face is this. And let me read this. And I read this to this group of accountants without telling them where it came from. But here's what someone said 2,000 years ago. I don't understand what I do. What I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, I do. And I keep on doing what I do not want to do. I know that good itself does not dwell in me. That is, in my nature. I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. And everyone in the room sat there nodding their head. And they're a little bit surprised when they heard it came from Romans chapter 7 in the Bible. But to me, this sounds like a much more realistic description of the problem you and I face. We know what is good. It's just so difficult to do it. We know there are some things we shouldn't be doing, but we just keep on doing them. There is a way of talking about truth and trust and work and life. There's a way of talking about integrity that sounds tyrannical, because it seems to demand something from us that we cannot possibly give. That's something that we cannot possibly obtain. Before I became a Christian, I can remember I was fighting against the idea. I didn't want to become a Christian. I didn't trust Christians. I felt they had nothing and they wanted to share it with me. And the best way to summarize how I felt was that, I didn't give myself a score out of 10. I never sat down and did that. But I think if you were to ask me before I was a Christian, Michael, how do you think you're doing in life? I would have said, 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10. Things were going pretty well. Everything had gone well, more or less up until that point. And by becoming a Christian, it felt like I'd be dropping to like 1 out of 10 in life. Does that make sense? That my life, whatever happiness I had, would somehow be gone. But maybe I'd be believing the truth, because I'd become convinced that the Christian faith was true long before. And I suddenly realized one day while sitting up on a mountain while chain smoking my way through a pack of cigarettes that I didn't want the Christian faith to be true. I feared it was true. I'd come to the conclusion it was true. I was utterly sure it was true. I was also sure it would make me miserable in the process. And so I just realized I just didn't want to believe it. And part of my problem, very simply, was to do with the issue of hypocrisy. So before I was a Christian, I wasn't pretending to be anything special. I wasn't pretending to be particularly good. And I was succeeding at it. But at least I wasn't pretending to be something I wasn't. But by becoming a Christian, it suddenly felt like I was saying, hey, there's a standard and it's way up here. And your life is actually down here. Well, how on earth do you live with that constant tension of failure? How on earth do you live with the reality of a standard which is so much higher than you, no matter how hard you try, you can't possibly obtain it? In short, I didn't want to be a hypocrite. I was utterly sure if I became a Christian, I'll be miserable as a result. And that's where I totally fail to understand one of the most essential and important parts of what it means to become a Christian. Because the Christian faith isn't about shouting a moral standard from the rooftop and telling everybody else you've all failed. It's actually slightly more profound from that. It's actually saying that there is a standard which out there and it's fixed, and we actually all fall short of it. But there's a possibility of forgiveness for when we mess up. I can remember one of the people I was speaking to, they said, Michael, when I made a decision to become a Christian, it wasn't a decision to be perfect. It was a decision to be forgiven. See, all of us in our human heart, no matter what noble things we aspire to, we fall short. Sometimes we see great things in people's hearts. My eldest daughter is 18. When she was 14, 15, I was going away on a long trip. And as I was going, she'd grown her hair all the way down to below the small of her back. So it had grown all the way down. I don't know how long it was, but she's 5'11", so it must have been long hair. And I was going on this trip, and Lucy said to me, Dad, I just need you to be prepared for a shock, because when I come back, my hair will be much shorter than it is now. So I didn't particularly think very much about that. But I realized that things were going to be slightly more dramatic than I envisioned when I landed back at Heathrow. And even before I got home, my wife rang me in the car and said, Michael, when you come home, you are to say nothing to Lucy, apart from the fact that she looks beautiful. And so I'm a man under authority, so I do exactly as I'm told. I knock on the door, and my eldest daughter opened the door. Her hair had been cut up to here. And so I just smiled and said, sweetheart, you look beautiful. Put my arms around her, gave her a hug. Now, about 2 days later, my wife was off. She leads the cello section in an orchestra where we live in Oxford. And she was off doing a rehearsal. And so now I'm alone with my daughter, finally with the opportunity to ask her the question I've been desperate to ask her for at least 48, 72 hours. And so I smile. Well, I'm sat on the thing, I breathe slowly in and out, so nice and calm. I don't want the wrong tone to somehow come out of my voice that could be misinterpreted. And I casually look across to her, and as relaxed as I can say, I said, so what prompted the change in hairstyle? I said, were you bored? Was it fashion? Did you want something different? And she said, a few weeks ago, I saw this documentary about this charity, and they make wigs for young girls with leukemia who've lost all their hair. And they were saying how they struggle to find enough hair to make wigs for these little girls. And she said, so I decided, while you were away, I'd have my hair cut. She had a hairdresser come round and plait it in a special way and tie it off and cut it off and put it in an envelope and mail it off to this charity. And so as Lucy told me this story, my eldest daughter is a very avid reader. And she'd read a few years earlier, a book called Little Women. And in that story, there's a scene where the heroine of that novel, by the name of Elizabeth, she sells her hair in order to buy a train ticket so her mother can go and visit her father who's dying in a military hospital thousands of miles from home. And when the mother sees what the daughter has done, the mother looks at the daughter and says, your hair will regrow, but you'll never be more beautiful to me than you are right now. And so as Lucy told me the story, I said, Lucy, do you remember in Little Women that scene? And she said, yes. And I said, that's the only line I can think of to say to you right now. The incredible thing about the human heart is we can look in it and see such great capacity for kindness. And in the same human heart, selfishness, greed, anger, lust, all mixed up in the same heart. That's the incredible thing. Which is why we all aspire and we all want to live one life. But we all feel that we're confined to leading another. Which is why integrity feels impossible. We have to pretend to be one thing at work and another thing with the family and another thing when we're in public society and then another thing when we're in private. And we feel like our heart's being just cut a dozen different ways. There is no integration. There's nothing that holds it all together. But the incredible thing that you find about in the Christian faith, and what Paul talks about here when he talks about all the things that he doesn't want to do and keeps on doing, he eventually ends on a note of despair. He says, who will rescue me from this body of death? And then he has an answer. Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Jesus came into this world in order to take these human hearts of ours and change and transform them into something new, into something different. He came to achieve two things in this world. The first one is forgiveness. God knows exactly what all of our lives are like. There's no pretending before him. He sees the mess, he sees the hurt, he sees the pain, and he sees the damage. There's no fooling him. He sees it all. And even though he's seen every single aspect of it, the Bible says that even before we loved God, he loved us. God loved us when we were still his enemies, came into this world to rescue us and to forgive us out of this condition we find ourselves in. Now, one of the things that I didn't count on before I became a Christian was just how much this encounter with Christ could change someone. Now, I'd love to say that after I became a Christian, I've been perfect and I haven't made any mistakes. That's not true. But it would also be true to say, it would also not be true to say that nothing changed. I can remember after I became a Christian, I felt this enormous sense of joy and relief, which rather surprised me, because when I became a Christian, I felt like I was sacrificing on the altar of truth my only chance for happiness and fulfillment in this world. So I was expecting to feel a bit depressed about the whole thing. But I seemed unusually happy about the whole thing. And then I thought, when I go home, everybody's going to want to know why I'm like this, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer their questions. So I decided I'll tell nobody I'd become a Christian for at least a few months while I tried to figure out what the likely questions would be and how I could best answer them. Well, that strategy didn't work. The very next day, I met a young lady who was a model, who was one of the reasons I didn't want to become a Christian, if that makes sense. I had been utterly unsuccessful in all of my attempts, and she walked into the same room that I was in. She took one look at me. I didn't even say hello. One look at me, and she said, "You've changed. Something's happened to you. What happened?" And I said, "I'm not sure I can explain." She said, "Well, try." So I said, "Well, I became a Christian yesterday." She said, "What does that mean?" I said, "Look, I don't know if I can answer that question that's going to really satisfy you, but one of the things I know for sure is I'm not the person now that I was before." She leant over, looked at me in the eyes and said, "Would you like to sleep with me?" Now, I remember sitting there looking at her and said, if you'd only asked me 24 hours ago, the answer would have been yes. I said, but today the answer is no. And here's the thing that shocked me. I wasn't the least bit disappointed with my answer. I began to experience some small transformation, not just simply what I had to do, but what I wanted to do. We talk a lot about integrity and ethics in our world, but integrity and ethics becomes tyrannical if we can't answer three other questions. The other three questions we must be able to answer if these things are so important is, number one, when I mess up, is there anyone I can talk to? If you can't answer that question in your life, in your family, or even in your business, you can destroy it. That's what happened to Arthur Andersen. Number two, if I do talk with someone, is there any hope? Because if there's no hope in that situation, if you feel hopeless, you're going to bury your failure and it's going to stay right there. And then the third question is, well, if there is hope, then what's this process of redemption I can go through that somehow gets me through the other side? Truth and trust is essential to all areas of work and life because it runs right to the core of every single important relationship that we have. And most of all, even with our relationship with God. When we fail before him, Jesus Christ assures us that there is someone we can talk to. There is hope. And there is a process of redemption that he himself has secured because he has paid for our own failings. And that's the message of the gospel, that God has stepped into this world and taken our failure and our sin into and onto himself. He deals with the very thing which is a relational barrier between us and him. And he pays the price. And he lays down his life. And he takes the consequence for what we have taken on. And through his resurrection offers new life and forgiveness to every single one of us. And that's the most incredible thing. Because when you have failed and been forgiven, you know you don't have to be secret about it anymore. And there's a tremendous freedom that comes with that. And it'll be my hope and prayer that every single person in this room would know that freedom that the person of Jesus Christ can bring. Now, what you'll notice in front of you, we're about to go into a time of Q&A, is that there are some cards on your seats. And this card helps with the Q&A process. Now, here's what we'll do with the Q&A. If you want to ask a question, just stand up or raise your hand, and I think there's someone with a microphone, and they'll come round to you and give you the microphone. I saw a cartoon a little while ago where the moderator of a meeting was speaking to an audience, and the moderator said, "We will now have a time for short speeches to be delivered by the audience disguised as questions." That's not the purpose of this. The purpose of this is to try and deal with some of the questions that may have arisen out of this. I'll try and deal with as many as I can. If you can think your question through and keep it succinct, that will allow us to cover as many questions as we can in the time we have remaining. Now on the card, you'll see there's a place where you can write your question. So here's what we'll do. If you tick the box that says I have a question, and you write your question down here, and you give us a way to contact you, someone will get back in contact with you and talk with you about your question, and we'll try and answer it to the very best of our ability if it doesn't get dealt with here tonight. Okay, so that's a promise which is made to every single one of you here in this room. Would love to be able to serve you that way. Now there's another little box that says, tell me more. If you're sitting here and you were brought along tonight as a non-Christian and someone told you it would be interesting and you're already feeling that they've deceived you because it wasn't interesting, but you are now here. And you're sitting and you're thinking, Michael, I'm not sure I'm convinced by any of this. But I think I'd like to find out more. I'd like to find out a bit more about what you're talking about. I'd like to find out about how this whole thing of forgiveness works within the Christian faith and what that actually means. Well, if that's you and you want to find out more, just tell me more. Leave a way for us to contact you. We'll get in contact with you and try and find out a way in which we can give you the information that you'd like to have. Now, the very first one of these boxes says, count me in. Now, if you're sat here this evening, and while you've been listening to this, it's almost like God himself, it feels like, has reached somehow into your heart and mind and just laid his hand on you. And you're listening to this and you're thinking, I need to know this forgiveness in my life. And this process of redemption you talked about even very briefly, that God comes into the world in the form of Christ, gives his life to death on the cross and becomes sin for us. And through his death and resurrection secures both our redemption and our forgiveness and offers a new life in him. If you're sitting here and you think, I need to say yes to that, then just before we go into the time of Q&A, I'm going to offer a very, very brief prayer for anyone who would like to say yes. So here's what I'd like to invite you all to do. Just take a moment just to be quiet. Maybe just close your eyes to give some privacy in the room. My suggestion to you is if you are closing your eyes, please do put your hand on your wallet or your purse. We live in a wicked and fallen world and you have no idea who's sat next to you. And if as you're sat here, you're saying, look, this needs to be for me. Will you just pray for this forgiveness for me? I'm going to offer this a very short prayer that thanks God for the forgiveness he's secured for us and ask that you may know that reality in your life as you hand over your life to him. So if there is anyone here, just very briefly, just raise your hands so I know who I'm praying for. If anyone, you may all be Christians here, or there may be no one in that place, that's fine. But if there is, I'd just like to offer that moment now. Okay, all right. Let me just say this prayer very briefly. Father, thank you that you both know me and you know who I am. You know both where I failed, and Lord, you also know even the failed aspirations of my heart. And I'm sorry for the situation I find myself in now, but I do thank you that you made it possible that I may know forgiveness in my life. Lord, thank you for the price you paid, whereby that burden becomes yours, and may you take it from me. May I know that new life with you and in you, and help me to follow you, whatever it may cost. Amen. If you did pray that, or you didn't, but you sitting here and you're thinking that's the one thing maybe I think I should have done, then if you tick count me in and just leave your name and email, we'll get in contact with you and then just talk about what next steps from here may be. Otherwise, I want to thank you for listening very, very well. You've done exceptionally well. No one's fallen asleep, which I always take as a bonus. And we'll now have a time of Q&A. So if anyone does have a question, I think here's the guy with the microphone. Do just put up your hand with a 100 rand note in it. No. The guy will pass you the microphone. I think we've got 3 or 4 people watching on YouTube, so we're using the microphone so that those people can actually hear what's also being said.
Thank you for the talk, Michael. In our country, we have a bill in Parliament that, if it goes through, might erode property rights in the country. And some of the best scenario planners in the country have predicted that if it goes through, we might be in the same economic situation as Venezuela in 12 years. And so my question is for young people who are looking for a better economic future, what advice would you have for them? And the second question is just for Christians that are thinking of immigrating, what would you say to them if they're looking for a better life for their family?
I'm glad we're not starting with any controversial questions. I was speaking this lunchtime, and I was sharing how in January I was speaking to 1,000 or 1,500 or so, I can't remember the exact numbers, maybe 2,000 leaders of campus ministries, Christian campus ministries from about 47 different countries across Europe. And the conference was being held in northern Cyprus. Now, I don't know how many of you know your political history, but in 1974, the Turkish army annexed northern Cyprus. And the only country in the world that currently recognizes northern Cyprus is Turkey. And Nicosia is the last divided capital city in the world. There's a green line that runs through the capital city, and it's patrolled by the UN. And so just like Berlin used to have, do you remember the Berlin Wall running through it? Well, there is a wall that runs through Nicosia. Now, the land that the conference was being held on used to belong to my family. My mother's Greek Cypriot. The country of Cyprus has been under foreign occupation for almost 3,000 years. So, we got pretty used to the fact of someone else owning most of the country anyway. But in 1974, my family and many other families suffered a particular loss. So now I'm speaking on a piece of land, probably once owned by my family, to thousands of people from all over Europe. What do I say? That's an interesting question, isn't it? And for a small amount of money, I'll tell you. I like using humor. The way I wanted to start was just by welcoming everybody to my home and saying, I guess I'm hosting you here. One way or another, it's really lovely to see you. And 3 days in, someone asked me, I guess the inevitable question, well, how do you feel about this? I mean, you must have feelings about it, right? And the answer is, yeah, sure. If you're asking me how I feel about the people, the answer is, well, I want to feel about them the same way I feel God feels about them. And the simple truth is that the same grace and forgiveness I needed to know in my life to become a Christian, they need to know in theirs. And I'm pretty sure God loves them just as much as he loves me. So however I treat them, however I interact with them, means that I need to bear that in mind. Now, would I love to see the situation righted and various other things? Then sure. There are hotels I'd like to build and a Ferrari I'd like to... No. Is that going to happen? I've got no idea. I doubt it. We're now so many generations down. Post-invasion, I think it's unlikely that we'll see any settlement there. So there are a couple of things I would say. When we look to restore all of the historical wrongs in any society, it's going to be very difficult. Because no matter how far you roll back the clock, you're going to have someone who conquered someone else. In 74, the side of my family, we were on the losing side. Does that make sense? That doesn't mean I think, therefore, we don't do anything to address those historical problems, but we have to recognize the complexity of them. So I don't know how far we need to go back to the Assyrians or to the Babylonians or to the Persians or to the Medians or any of the other Egyptians. I mean, Michael Antony gave Cyprus as a love gift to Queen Cleopatra. I mean, imagine your country being given as a love gift to your mistress. Here you go, have a whole country and all the people in it. I love you a lot. I mean, obviously he did. So somehow, at some point, we're going to have to try and figure this out. So what I'd want to say to anyone here is, first of all, if your hope is in this world, I'm afraid you're going to be very sorely disappointed. Because there's nothing you're going to get in this world that's ever going to fully satisfy you. Now, I don't think, therefore, that means that we have to ignore justice too, because I think we have to fight for it as well. But we also have to be very aware of the fact about what happens if we get the justice that we want. Jesus Christ once told a story to a rich guy, a young brother, who came to Jesus Christ to right an economic wrong. It was to do with land, actually. The younger brother came to Jesus and he said, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." So clearly, this is a younger brother. Must be, because the older brother inherits most of the estate. Okay, and that's what happens. If you're the number one son, the firstborn, you get the land. And I'd like to say, as a firstborn son, I think there's a lot of wisdom in this idea, and I think it should be adhered to. Now, Jesus' response to the guy who's making the request is fascinating, because on the face of it, he seems to be making a cry for justice. But Jesus' response is quite amazing. He looks at the guy and he says, "Take heed and beware of covetousness." Now, that word in the Greek is a compound word. It means unsatiable desire. It means a desire which no matter how much you feed it, it's never satisfied. So Jesus starts off by saying, look, you need to be careful of that. Then Jesus says, let me tell you a story. There was a man whose ground produced abundantly, came from the Euphrates, he had all these things, and from the Euphrates he said to himself, well, I've got so much grain, I'll tear down my barns, I'll build bigger barns, and I'll store everything there, and I'll say to myself, eat, drink, and be merry. Now, here's just a little word to the Christians in the room who aren't sure if you're allowed to be happy or not, in case you're wondering whether your theology allows it. Because we sometimes get down on that word merry. Now, we have to be careful here. Okay, the word translated merry in that story is the same word which is translated in Luke 15 when the father says about the prodigal son, but we had to make merry, we had to celebrate and be glad because this guy was dead and is alive again. It's the same word. So the word in and of itself doesn't carry any moral connotation. It's the context that allows you to say. The word is euphrone. We had to eat, drink, and euphrone. Now the phrone is the diaphragm. When you put the letters in Greek, EU, before anything else, it makes it bigger. I'm not making a political comment about Europe. Okay? I'm just saying that that's what EU does, euphrone. Now, are there any singers in the room? Anyone sing? How do you make the diaphragm bigger? Okay, you can see it there. Everyone's going, okay, you breathe in, you push down, that makes the diaphragm expand. So the guy who got now the abundance of things, this incredible wealth, he got everything he thought he ever wanted and more. He says, now I can take life easy and I can be merry. I can literally euphrone. I can go, that's the mental picture. Do you get it? And Jesus looks at the guy and Jesus continues the story. But God said to this man, you fool. Now, the Greek word for fool that's normally used is the Greek word moron. That's the Greek word. It translates into the English word moron. It means to be a moron. But that's actually not the word that's used here. The word which is used here is a much rarer Greek word. It's the word aphron. Now, the phron is the diaphragm. The Greek alpha is a negative. Now the mental image is the opposite of what the guy thought. You who think from the abundance of things, if you get all this wealth, you'll be euphrone. Once you get it, you'll be aphrone. And now the mental picture of someone who's totally empty inside. And so this is then when we then need to be very careful when we think through our cries for justice. My feeling is actually there are wrongs that are being done here, and we do need to think about how they can be righted. At the same time, we also have to realize that what will be delivered into the hearts of everyone who is on the receiving end, does it make sense, in a beneficial way of any changes that may come? It doesn't matter how much you have. It's simply not enough. Your heart will still be the same. And you think it will deliver one thing, but now you have to live with the reality of disappointment that it didn't bring what you thought it would. Now notice Jesus doesn't say to the guy, you haven't got a case, and he doesn't even say, you shouldn't get what you're asking for. Jesus actually ends in a very interesting way. He says, this is what it will be like for anyone who is rich towards themselves but not rich towards God. I mean, that's a slightly more like literal translation. In other words, if you're asking me this question because you're unhappy and you want fulfillment, you're only going to find that in relationship with God. If you have a rich relationship with him, no matter what befalls you, you're going to be okay. But if you don't have that relationship, even if you get more than everything you think you deserve, it still won't be enough. So I guess I'm trying to give an answer in two different ways. There has to be a concerted effort, I think, to deal with real historical wrongs. That's, I think, of course, and as Christians, we should be concerned about that. And at the same time, we also have to be realistic about what happens and what the Bible actually teaches about how wealth comes. We so often think wealth makes us purer. Well, I don't know. I mean, what's the history of your country? Were the wealthy people of this country the most morally pure? Anyone voting for that one? Okay. Are there any easier questions that don't involve me giving answers that might have me forcibly thrown out of the country?
When do you know that you're transgressing an ethical boundary?
Yeah.
When you're actually following the rules in a situation.
How do you know you're
Transgressing an ethical boundary in a situation when you're following the rules.
right? So you're following the rules of whatever company you're in, but you're still actually breaching the ethics.
Yeah. Sometimes, other times you wouldn't, but in this case,
Yeah.
you would. I hope that's
No, it is. I got asked a very similar question once by someone who was in a really difficult position, and I don't want to say too much about it, otherwise I'm trying to think how I can frame this to put some legs on it. Forgive me for being careful with my answers. I get invited to speak to a lot of boards of some really quite major companies around the world, and sometimes I have these discussions with them, so you can imagine how they would feel if I were to say, oh, yeah, this group asked me this following question. I was talking with someone who was involved in an incredibly globally high-profile property development that was being marketed around the world, and if I were to tell you, everyone in this room would know where it was. It's on the map, quite literally. And his problem, the way he put it to me was this. He said, look, we underestimated the cost of this thing quite dramatically by billions. We're talking dollars, not rand. He said, what we've done is, without telling everybody, we've made all the plots much smaller. And we're still using the original drawings, and the original drawings show a car parked between each house in this multi-thousand house development. Except the gaps between the houses now are far too narrow. You couldn't get any car in there. Okay, maybe the old-style British Mini, but even then you couldn't open the doors. He says, and what's more, we're also telling people that if they pay 50%, an additional 50% deposit on the value of the thing up front, we'll let them choose the style of house they want, A, B, C, or D. And the deal is you can't have two Bs together or two As together. So does that make sense? So, hey, you pay more quickly, you will, you can get to choose, so long as you get in quick enough. If you get in, even if you respond quickly, but you're slightly too late, you lose the choice. He says, but we've already decided who's going to get which house. And his job was to develop the advertising to market that to the rest of the world. Now, isn't that interesting? I wonder what you would do. Now, here's the problem. We love the idea of ethics and morals so long as it's someone else's responsibility. And we're very happy about it so long as someone else has to pay. But what happens if it comes down to us? What do we do? And that's a much harder question, isn't it? Did any of you hear John Lennox speak here on Sunday? Yeah, he's an okay speaker. We're trying to encourage him to get better. We've been mentoring him for a while. I remember John telling me the story of a young electrician who he knew. And the guy had just been fired. The reason he'd been fired from his job was that his job was to do the wiring under the floors in this housing new build. And the foreman came to him and said to him, look, you're way slower than everybody else. All the other electricians working here, they're doing the wiring 2 to 3 houses a day. You're doing 1 to 1.5. He says, it's not acceptable. He says, either you up your pace or you lose your job. So the guy was, I think, married with a young family, and he said to the foreman, well, sir, I just don't understand how the other guys are doing this, because he says, I'm putting in extra hours, I'm coming in early, I'm leaving late, and I can't do it. He says the way you have to do the wiring, with all the different types of insulation that you're required to use by law to prevent electrical fires and stuff. He says, I can't go any faster than I'm doing it. He says, I just don't know how they're doing it. And the foreman put his arm around this guy and said, son, nobody looks under the floorboards. So what does he do? What would you suggest? This young guy looked at the foreman and said, my Lord does. But let me ask you a question. Even if let's suppose you're a property developer here and you're sitting thinking, yeah, but we're under such pressure. Well, let me ask you a question. If you were buying a house for your son or daughter which house would you want to have bought from that development? Which electrician would you have preferred to have done the wiring in the house? There are some times and some situations where we're going to put in where taking an ethical stance is going to cost us heavy. Before the global financial crisis, I did this piece of research about the global financial, it hadn't happened then. I did this piece of research in the late 1990s. And I remember my wife walking into this study one day and I was in floods of tears. And she said, "Why are you crying?" I said, "I think this whole thing's going to collapse." And so I did some research on why I thought there'll be a systemic collapse in the Western financial banking system. I'd like to take credit and say I got everything right. I got a couple of things wrong in my research. I thought that a huge political event would cause the financial crisis of 2008, and it didn't, so I got that wrong. And I also thought when the financial crisis came, the dollar would collapse, which seems only fair for that rebellious nation to be punished in that way, but that didn't happen either. So I got two major things wrong in my research, but other things I got right. And I can remember in 05, 06, talking with some pretty senior bankers of some of the world's most senior institutions who took me aside and said, "We're involved in this deal. We're involved in this deal. We think there's something wrong with it." And when they explained to me what they were doing, I had to say to them, "Look, even if this is legal, you have to ask yourself, is it ethical?" And all of them said the same thing: "Look, I can't afford to lose my job." When the financial crisis hit and institutions around the world got into trouble, I do remember thinking, wow, if some of those people had been brave enough to take a stand, guess who would be on the front line to be rehired right now to take over that place and run it properly? Look, it can cost us a lot sometimes to do the right thing. And very often we need a particular form of bravery to commit ourselves to doing it, even when there are all other kinds of things that come in its wake. But it's a great question, and it's a hard one, and it's the nearest advice I can give you without knowing the ins and outs of all of it. Let me just say one other thing. If you're a Christian here, please don't take minor things and make them absolutely major. Okay? Sometimes as Christians we're good at that. We translate the idea of being holy into being rude. So the more people we offend and upset, the more holy we are. That isn't necessarily also the right thing to take. We have to look at this in a very clear way, and we need to be very clear about when we need to make a stand. For instance, and very, very clear about it. And then we need to be very clear on what the basis is that we're doing it. I probably won't be let back in the country after this. I did do a series of talks in India a while ago to some of the biggest business owners in the country called The Economics of Corruption, which was looking at what Scripture teaches about that. And if we have time for a brief conversation afterwards, I'll try and give you some highlights out of that. Is that it? Can we go home now? Oh, one more question. Feel free to ask any question. Do I moisturize? Because I know many of you are thinking that question.
I just want to ask you something. In light of what the other gentleman, in the context of South Africa, the issues of land, sexuality and gender, and this passive approach that the church has assumed over the longest time, do you think that it's necessary for church to take a more militant approach in terms of rather than sitting back and allowing secular institutions deciding on the morality and the ethics and the norms of society as a whole?
This definitely is my last visit to South Africa, right? Well, let me just start by referring back to my previous answer. The difficult thing for the church should be, I think if we're dealing with most things biblically, everybody isn't going to hear what they want. Does that make sense? And then a little bit, that's what we said to the first answer. Look, there are wrongs here that need to be righted. At the same time, for instance, we also need to be very careful about what people think they will get if they actually get what they're hoping for. Does that make sense? Well, normally most people say, look, pick a side. You see this very clearly in Scripture. In the book of Isaiah, the way Isaiah 1 starts out is Israel finds itself caught between two economic superpowers, and they're trying to figure out who to align themselves with. Does that make sense? Which of these two economic superpowers do we align ourselves with, military superpowers, in order to have the best future for our country? And Isaiah comes and says, you need to align yourself with God first. Which is why he got sawn in two. I mean, neither side liked that response. So, at the risk of becoming two rather than one, history doesn't tell a very happy story of when the church has married itself to political power. So we have to be very careful about that. If you decide to marry the spirit of the age, you'll very quickly become a widow. Okay, so we have to make sure that we're first and foremost committed to the Lord. Secondly, that normally means that in almost any dispute, there's going to be rights and wrongs on both sides. Does that make sense? I'll give you an example. Have any of you ever had close friends who divorced? How many of you had that experience? Okay, so you talk to the husband, and you listen to the husband, and you conclude that he's married the witch of Endor. I mean, this is the most evil person that's walked the face of the planet, right? Then the next day you have lunch with her, and you conclude that she's married some kind of, crazy nutter who seems to be from almost another world. Have you had this experience? And out of the hurt on both sides, they're both distorting what's happened to them. Now, here's the hard thing, and it's really hard. Have any of you had a friend fall in love with someone else who you know isn't good for them, is using them? Have you seen that? Have any of you tried to talk to your friend and say, look, this other person is just using you? Have you tried that? Okay, I see you smiling. Did it go well? Hey, no, okay. It's really hard, isn't it? Because as soon as you question them, they go, why don't you love me? Why can't you just be happy for me? Why can't you say it's all okay? Now, here's the challenge. We live in a culture that equates disagreement with hatred. If you disagree with me, you hate me. If you love me, you would affirm everything I'm saying. But love and affirmation aren't the same thing. As a matter of fact, the reason you may disagree with someone is because you love them so much. So here's the hard thing, therefore, I think the church with all political things, I think it should have a voice into politics. But I don't think it's so much necessarily to even more important than advocating for a cause. The first thing it has to first and foremost advocate is what's ultimately right and wrong. And that's when then you need the wisdom of Solomon to implement it. And it's not easy. My traveling colleague, Jim Wigglesworth, and I was just sat up here at the front. And if, by the way, if at the end you want any follow-up to any of this, if you go and give him your business card and with your email ID and whatever it is that you question or something you have, he will try and do his best to make sure we're back in touch with you. But I was speaking to one of the leaders of one of the British political parties. And we were talking about ethics and morality. And I said to the guy, look, I have a real problem at this point. I said, right now, in this house, in the Houses of Parliament, there's an argument going on saying we should legalize prostitution, that being involved in pornography is like a job like any other. Make sense? We should affirm it, okay? And there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. And at the same time, while arguing that, this house has just thrown out an MP for watching pornography online on their computer. So how can you argue at the same time that pornography is fine and prostitution is great, while also saying you'll fire any MP and they'll be thrown out of politics if they watch pornography and they use something which is perfectly okay? The guy sort of sat back in his chair and went, but do you see the problem? So what I'm trying to say to the guy is, look, you're trying to employ certain moral standards here, and I'm basically saying there seems to be a lot of hypocrisy going on here. Here's the hardest thing I think the church needs to do, and it is very difficult. We are very prone to self-righteous anger. Self-righteous anger is basically, looks like we're concerned about justice, but actually we're just upset. But we've hitched it to a certain issue. Does that make sense? The trouble with self-righteous anger is that it's deadly. If you're self-righteously angry with somebody, look, I'm sure we've all had this experience. Have you ever said something and you wish you never said it? Okay, so you need to go and apologize the next day and you hate yourself for it. Does that make sense? You were in an argument and you said something nasty about them and you know it's not true, and now you have to go and tell them and apologize, and you don't even want to apologize to them because they're not a very nice person anyway, and now they're going to have the satisfaction. Have you ever been, is it just me who gets caught up in this mess, or is that, okay, all right. So in other words, you said something which was wrong, and now you feel guilty. However, when you're self-righteously angry with somebody, you can falsely accuse them of something and the next day wake up feeling good about it. Because they're so bad, they're so evil, they're so malicious, they deserved everything you said about them, and even worse. You don't feel any guilt at all. You actually feel pretty good about yourself. And that's a very dangerous path to go down, which is why Jesus Christ talked about self-righteousness so strongly. So I think the hardest thing for the church as we engage with all of these political issues, and I think we have to, and I think we do have to speak, is we also have to figure out what is the tone in all of this. How am I speaking? That I'm better than everybody else? That I'm more self-righteous than everybody else? That I know better than everybody else? The church, as Christians, we need to learn what it is to plead someone's cause. And when we plead someone's cause, that's not threatening them with abuse or even trying to manipulate them with power. That's down on our knees, crying and weeping and begging them to do what is right while crying out to God that our trust is ultimately in him. Does that make sense? But I think we have to engage. We can't not engage. It's simply not possible. The Bible just says so much about truth and justice and why it's important. We have to stand up for it. So maybe there are times when we need to be more engaged, but we need to be so careful about the tone with which we do it. The hard thing in many situations, when you have a very messy situation, look, I don't want to talk about here because I don't know the situation here well enough. In Cyprus a decade ago, there was a solution where everybody who had land would be paid whatever it was, hundreds of thousands of dollars an acre. Make sense? So everyone who had their land dispossessed would get money, and the people who took the land would get to keep it, and it was rejected by the people who were going to get the money. As I say, for me, in that situation, and I think it could well be different here, I just find it so hard to imagine how we'd roll back the clock properly. Does that make sense? I can see my own family fighting for them over themselves. Does that make sense? Because the question is, who did they buy it from? And then who did they buy it from? The trouble is we've got so many conquering empires. Does that make sense? Trying to figure out where it all ultimately goes is going to be a little bit tricky. We're Middle Easterners. We love to fight. So I think we have to speak, but when it comes to how this is properly implemented in a godly and peaceful way, that's really hard. Have I said enough on this? So it's getting late. It's 8:45. That basically means we're going to turn into a pumpkin, and some people came here at 6:20 for a meeting they thought they started at 6:30, so they've been here for almost 3 hours. So I think, first of all, you should give them a round of applause for sitting through this for so long. If any of you have been here for 3 hours and you're going to have trouble standing up now, just raise your hand and someone will come and gently lift you out of the seat to get the circulation flowing again. It has been a real delight for me to be here. I really hope that this evening has been helpful. I wish I knew some more about the intricacies of some of what is also going on here. Let me finish with just one brief story, if I may. I can say this briefly without repeating everything. When I was speaking at lunchtime, I used the following illustration. I talked about Superman, the original Superman. Have any of you seen the original Superman movie, 1980s, Christopher Reeves? Yeah? Okay, that's 7 of you. The rest of you are culturally illiterate. Now, if you've seen the original Superman movie, in that movie, Superman has no weaknesses. I mean, 0. Apart from kryptonite, physically perfect, rationally perfect, morally perfect, sensitive, kind, strong, dependable. But that's enough about me. I mean, he's perfect. He has no flaws. I mean, 0. Have any of you seen the Superman remake, Man of Steel? Can any of you remember how that movie starts? Superman is on a boat in the middle of a storm. He's angry. He feels cosmically abandoned by his parents. He feels culturally cut off and alien in a world that he's not even meant to live in. He feels that people are demanding and expecting something of him that he cannot give. He feels totally disconnected from the world which is around him. He doesn't fit. You talk about feeling an alien and a foreigner. I mean, his home is halfway around across the galaxy. And he's in a state of depression. And he's angry. Why do I say this? For Superman to be a hero today, he has to have a hurtful and painful past for us to aspire to make him a hero. Have you noticed that? If you watch any Marvel movies, you'll notice that almost all of the heroes in the Marvel movies also have this terrible past. They all have to be victims. Does that make sense? They all have to be victims of abuse or abandonment or hurt or betrayal or whatever it is for them to be honored, for us to look up to them. It's a very strange thing when we live in a culture that says in order to have status, you have to be hurt. And the danger of that is that when that comes into our hearts, it means that we're all looking to be hurt in order to have status, which is why someone has said, it has never felt, the only thing that is better than feeling right in today's world is feeling wronged. Okay, because the more wronged you've been, the more status you have. Well, all that does is it breeds a society in which we have competitive victimhood. We're all competing with each other about how much pain and suffering we've been through. Now, I've already played my trump card today. My trump card is I come from a country that's got 3,000 years of foreign occupation. So that means I've got more victim narrative, does that make sense, in my history? Probably than most people here. Although some of you may have 3,500 years. I don't know enough about the history. I'll have to find out. But that's not ultimately the way in which we need to look for leadership. We need leadership in this world as never before. We need people who can rise themselves above some of the intricacies and actually learn to speak to a nation. And when you speak to a nation, what you're trying to very often do is you're trying to say two things at the same time. You're telling one group, look, what happened to you was wrong and we need to work to figure it out. And at the same time, you're saying, but that doesn't justify you doing something wrong over here, so don't do that either. And that's a very hard place to occupy. But when it's occupied well, that's what leads to statespeople in this world. That's what leads to the kinds of people, men and women, who transcend their own culture and are admired around the world because they were able to step into even the hardest and most difficult of situations and somehow bring it around in a peaceable way that actually helped everyone who was involved in it. And we need people like that like never before. We're in a desperate world where we're looking for that kind of leadership that is committed and is able to achieve those things. And we desperately need to see it come about. Half of my family were all Middle Eastern heritage. We've been fighting over some of these issues in the Middle East for 2,500 years. I'm aware of virtually 0 wars in that region that aren't driven by land. And everyone's got a historical claim they can trace back through some document somewhere as to what on earth is going on. But it doesn't seem to have helped particularly. We're caught up in a vortex of grievance, and we need to find a way to break it through. Jesus Christ offers all of us forgiveness, even when we are guilty of the most terrible of things. And we need to figure out what it means to forgive as we have been forgiven, while at the same time making a stand for justice and fighting for those things which we know to be true and right. So when we stand up for the truth, let's make sure we also do it with gentleness and respect. And let's try and do it in a way that actually models something different for the world. Because otherwise, it's very hard to see a way through peaceably for this world right now, unless we can actually find a way to love each other more through our disagreements than we like to hate each other as we actually say bad things about each other's backs. Well, look, you've been just so gracious. You've been very, very kind. I really appreciate it. I'm so happy to be back here. I can't wait to have some more of the South African food. I'll make one last promise. If you came here as a non-Christian, and you came, especially if you came early and you've waited now 3 hours to get to this point, you should go with something free. So there's a bookshop out there. If there's a book out there that you would like, take it, give them my name, and I will buy you a book. Okay, you can have the book for free. Just tell them that you came along here, you're not a Christian, but you like one of the books, you can have it. Now, there's a small possibility that there may be 1 or 2 Christians here who would like a free book. And you are contemplating having a sudden crisis of conscience, so you can go to the bookshop and say, well, I'm not really sure if I am a Christian or not, so can I have the book? It will really help. To you, I would like to say, there will be a day of judgment, and God will hold you to account. And to everyone else, I hope you have a very good night, and thank you so much for coming. It's been a joy for me to be here.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much for your generosity of heart and mind. And if you want to come to engage, you're welcome to come to the front and engage with our wonderful friends from the UK. On Monday evening, this is something we have changed at Hatfield Christian Church. We are hosting Ravi Zacharias on Monday evening for Q&A in the main auditorium here. And we've advertised that initially as 7:30 p.m., that is. And subsequently found out that Mr. Zacharias needs to catch an airplane rather early-ish, later in the evening. So we decided to give him more time to answer more of your questions and to engage with you more. So we are starting at 7 o'clock. Please, if you know anybody that was planning to come, or post it on your Facebook, your social media, tell your friends, if you have some, that we're starting at 7 o'clock p.m. in the main auditorium. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and have a great time. And just to say, if you are one of these Christians that pretend to be non-Christian to get a free book, I will be standing there at the book table to pray with you. Have a great night.